bit about myself. I'm an advisor in the Biz Innovation Hub London Center. For those of you who may not be familiar, the BIS, which I hope you are familiar with, kind of works in the capacity as central bank for central banks globally. And about 5 years ago, it stood up the innovation hubs, which are kind of mandated with viewing technological advancements around the world and starting to look at how that might apply to the remit of central banks. So where are those areas where the central banks either because they're operating by themselves can't kind of tie in and bring in a community to solve a specific problem? Where are those areas that the Innovation Hub could kind of step in and provide some sort of public good for the central banking community or the community as a whole? We have a couple different kind of key domain areas of focus. You'll see a lot of our projects touching on many of these aspects. But Project Keystone today is really in what we're calling this sub-tech and reg-tech kind of space. How do we understand and supervise the information that's flowing through payments systems? This is the standard slide that I show in all of these presentations. I don't think anyone here needs to hear about ISO 222 again. I think Michael's given some excellent presentations on why this standard is particularly important. But what we saw is that because globally there's such a move to using ISO 20022, we figured as the Innovation Hub, well, maybe there's a place for us to kind of play, to kind of create something in one specific location and then give it away around the world so that multiple people don't have to kind of recreate the same analytics solution for ISO data. When we think about it, there's kind of three main things that brought us to the need for a project like this. The first is around the ISO 20022 format. This is not applicable to Moser Loop because you have intelligently dodged the bullet of the XML trees. But XML is not particularly an easy data structure to work with. And our kind of initial focus is around the RTGS systems, which are using, for the most part, these XML payload files. So how do we handle that? Next, there's new information that's in this data standard. If you're using the data standard to its full potential, you can unlock additional insights. So how do we start to focus on what's new in these payment messages? How do we use those insights? And then finally, like I kind of initially mentioned, it's a community issue. So it's something that everyone who adopts ISO in some way or another will need to analyze the payments messages that are flowing through their system. So we have basically two main goals and then one secondary goal. The first is do something to take the information that's contained in those ISO messages and make it easy to use. How do we enable payments analysts to quickly and easily access this information? Second, what do you then do with that information? Why is it useful? Why should we care about information that's in payments messages? And then finally, what we want to do is the Innovation Hub is kind of open source, send this out to the central banking community, enable people to interact with this technology in a way that they don't have to, one, reinvent the wheel, or to pay some expensive vendor fees to have them develop it for them. So when you think about Keystone, it's kind of in two main buckets. The first is around pulling the information out of the RTGS system. The second is around, again, what do we do with that information? Very briefly, we're essentially extracting information out of the payment system, and we're providing kind of a very flexible way for that information to come in. Every payment system is going to be designed slightly differently, so very non-prescriptive about how that needs to be done. The second and third stages are probably where the most interesting things start to happen. So taking the data and enriching it, deciding, well, maybe an element of someone's address was included, but it wasn't quite included in the way that we might hope that it is in a better version of ISO in the future. Are there other pieces of information that can be pulled out of the LEI information or the BIC information that can provide a more rich picture of the payments landscape? And then finally, we got to store the data somewhere. So we place it in some data structure that's easy to use for analysts that may not know terms like ultimate creditor, ultimate debtor, but they just need to know where the money came from and where it went in the end. The more interesting things, to me at least, and I think we'll touch on this in our discussion a little bit later, is what you can actually start to do with this data. Now, I'll focus from kind of the RTGS side, and we'll leave the instant payment side to a little bit later in this discussion. But there's three things that are particularly interesting that we see payments data being able to unlock. The first is around liquidity monitoring, liquidity management. What we can do is we can start to look at network typologies of these payment systems. Who's paying who? Are they being paid back immediately? Are there circular networks that are evolving in the payments system? And then kind of the second order questions of, well, how quickly are these pieces of payments data, or how quickly are these payments flowing around? Are people waiting, are banks waiting for payments to come in the door so that they can send them out? Those are things that could be indicators of potentially liquidity strains. Next, we have the macroeconomic conditions. If anyone's looked at kind of economic reports around, let's say, housing prices or housing purchases that may occur, you'll see those pieces of data are about 3 months old, and that's about as good as we do. So for your policymakers in your institutions, they don't have really good insight in a real-time manner on what's actually happening in the economy. They need to wait months, weeks to actually get that information. And what payments data actually allows us to do is start to unlock and bring forward when we start to learn about these key trends. We can see maybe card spending against merchants is down, spending against house purchases, mortgage purchases. Those things could be changing, and we can see that very quickly. The final components around messaging standards. ISO is meant to be a kind of internationally recognized standard. I think the more you talk to people, the more you'll realize that one person's ISO 20022 is not the next person's ISO 20022. And then you run into a whole bunch of issues. So the CPMI, who's one of the committees under the BIS, has released some cross-border recommendations. And so one of the things that we're doing with the project is kind of aligning and saying, okay, you're using certain parts of the required data set. We'd really like it if you use these other parts because that's particularly helpful. So the last thing I'll talk about here before we kind of turn over into a discussion is we do have an upcoming tech sprint that we'll be launching in the early summer. And basically, this is a way to kind of allow payment system operators to kind of come in the door, propose new analytics modules that they may be interested in seeing, talk about how standardized data can really unlock collaboration. You know, if I'm analyzing my data in this way and you're analyzing your data in this way, are there use cases that are particularly helpful because we have that shared set of information? And then finally, along kind of what policy insights can be unlocked with near real-time data. If you could see kind of these purchases of this particular asset happening, you know, the day after they happened, rather than 3 months later when the housing data is published, what could that actually do for you as a policy maker? And with that, I'll turn back over to you.
Thank you for your presentation. Before we start the discussion on effectively understanding a bit more how this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, how this can be utilized for an IIPS. Is there any burning question in the room on the presentation? Yes.
I just have to ask the question, what database did you use for your ETL to load it into?
It's Postgres.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like big enough to need like big
Right.
data requirements?
We made a very intentional decision to go between scalability and usability.
Yeah.
Right. We wanted to ensure that everyone who wanted to could use this with or without kind of these complex, we tossed around doing the full Kafka kind of event processing, streaming. And what we really decided on is that for the most part, we can do all of these things at scale without kind of over engineering it. Now, if we're talking about very large payment systems, instant payment systems in particular, we may run into kind of the scalability issue. But like I was kind of mentioning at the start, if we focus it on RTGS at the beginning, get that correct, well, then, just a few million messages a day is way, way more than sufficient.
Yeah, cool. And in your slide, you said something about in the how does it work slide, it was like the understanding of network typologies and risks under liquidity management. What are the sort of risks that you mean in that?
So there's a couple of different things that we kind of look at. The first really interesting one is timing of payments as a whole. So if you see payments throughout the network, and these are kind of wholesale payments, pushing back up against funding wire cutoffs, that's typically an indication that there's some sort of strain that may not be seen kind of anywhere else. But everyone is kind of holding on to payments until the very last minute and then sending them out right before they need to make those obligations. So that's something that's been indicative of potential liquidity strains.
Oh, because there's not enough liquidity to settle a payment now. You're waiting for the inbound.
Exactly.
wire.
So it's kind of operating off of a fear posture rather than kind of a
Yeah.
sufficient liquidity posture.
I see what you mean.
The second thing we're really interested in is banks that have high degrees of interconnectedness. So the middle of the graph network, if you think about payments as that. There's been some really interesting research out of the Bank of England where one of those core banks had a cyber outage and stopped processing payments. And so then what happens if one of your core institutions is out of order for 3 or 4 hours? Well, you need to be able to kind of quickly assess this institution is down. How connected are they? What other banks are not going to be getting payments in the door because they typically receive payments from that institution? And then how does that trickle through the rest of the network?
Right. Oh, that's really cool stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Is there any other burning question before we start the discussion? Okay, I'll take silence as a no. Thank you again for your presentation. I think like for me, one of the points that sort of stick out or a burning question I have right away is you mentioned that in the project scope, Keystone is focused on RTGS. Bojalup is not an RTGS system. It's a clearing system and an inclusive instant payment system. So how do you see like the application of Project Keystone in our area?
Well, I think it's a great question. So Keystone will function anywhere that kind of the ISO standard is used. One of the things we're really particular about is making it kind of plug and playable, if you will. So obviously the Mojo Loop software is not running kind of raw XML files that have to be parsed and used. So you don't need to use that part of the data pipeline. You could just use kind of the analytics engine components. And so I think my sales pitch, if you would, to someone who's thinking about it from like a Mojo Loop perspective is like, how do you start to enable those pieces of data access for your end users? How do you make it really easy for somebody who doesn't understand the ISO standard, but still needs to know who's paying who and kind of why they're being paid or when they're being paid? Like, how do you open up that ability for those data analysts? And so there's kind of that one first kind of foundational data layer component that's really helpful that we're working towards. But there's also kind of those pre-built analytics engines that I've talked about, not all of which would be appropriate for an instant payment system. I'll add.
Thank you for that. And I think like pushing this a bit more, like, like kind of going to the next level of my question as well. You mentioned like how having the ability for end customer to see how they're going to be paid and so on. Like, for example, in terms of use cases that are relevant for the adopter, could we be in the position where we apply these analytics on merchants payment and then understand how a merchant is being paid and potentially like I don't know, next step to this will be around lending, for example. Is that what you envisage? Like what, I mean, I'm asking the question as well because like we've seen throughout the 2 days that there are a lot to consider when you implement an instant payment system. Fraud is one of the things, dispute management is another thing, like data analytics is yet again another thing to consider. So that's why I'm asking about, yeah, why should any potential adopter consider this and what would be the use case that, yeah, they can really leverage the benefits of Project Keystone.
So I think you're absolutely right. The demands on time, the demands on people's focus when they're thinking about something that is as important as a payment system. You need to get those core foundational things right. Analytics is not a core foundational thing. It's nice to have, but it's not actually moving funds around. It's not allowing somebody to purchase something. Your point around the merchants, I think, is a really interesting one. Um, Going back to kind of, I was talking about like the housing use cases, those kind of big ticket items that we're focusing in on the RTGS. There's also ways to start to get that macroeconomic kind of nowcasting look for a payment system operator without purpose codes. You can start to look at kind of known merchant accounts, see how inflows into those accounts are changing over time. And even without kind of things like card bulk clearing purpose codes, which is how we're doing it from an RT perspective, you can start to kind of piece together additional insight into your economy in that near real-time basis. I think one of the really incredible things was if you paired insights from your RTGS and insights from your instant payment system, well, then you get a really kind of comprehensive view on kind of the economic activity that's going on. Now, the things like liquidity monitoring, you're not caring about in the instant payments world, but I would just encourage kind of thinking through what those use cases might be for the instant payment side.
Thank you for this. And it actually like for liquidity monitoring, I would say it depends because when you're touching a corridor which is highly liquid, ideally you want to think around your liquidity efficiency in the system as well. And because the system module loop, like, is still assuming pre-funding system, that you want to get some visibility around this, right? But Michael, um, I'd like to get your take a bit on this question as well, and like perhaps explain why the Modulo Foundation is following closely Project Keystone.
Well, of course, we're very interested in providing additional information for users of our system. There are problems associated with that. And I think that one of the reasons why we wanted to get involved with Project Keystone was to see if we could identify and address those problems very early on. So, for instance, let me take an example. We've said, I think, a number of times at this meeting that one of the things that we do is to, generally speaking, bulk up transfers, these very low value transfers, and do settlement via an RTGS deferred net. Now, let's say the actual settlements are not of very great interest from an analytical perspective. And you can see from what Micah was saying that it's much more interesting, for instance, to know what the pattern of payments for large merchants is. However, once you move down from the RTGS level, then you have the question to say, how many of these payments are not appearing in the module loop system because they're on-us payments? They are payments where two accounts in the same DFSP are parties to the payment. Now, those form part of the overall analytic pattern, but they won't appear anywhere in our analysis. And therefore, insofar as our analysis is an analysis at the level below the RTGS, we need to find some way of including those into our system. So that's one area, I think, where we need to be talking about how we can do that and how we can make sure that there is a comprehensive picture, which needn't I want to say this needn't necessarily be a comprehensive picture in a modular loop system. It may well be that modular loop feeds information to another system, which is having that, which is maintaining the comprehensive overall picture. But it's an important question, as I say, once you move down below the level of the RTGS. The second point, which is more about, I think, how we are using, how we want to use ISO 20022, is ISO 20022 is of course perfect. I mean, one of the imperfections is that it, in some way, it sits between something which has separate, semantically separate areas for each thing. Now, if you think of an address, the new ISO 20022 standard has something that says, if it's a street name, you put it in this element. If it's a town name, you put it in this element. If it's in a province, etc. And that's a highly structured piece of information. But it also has a lot of things which are not highly structured like that. So for instance, identifiers, which are the things that we use, are typically done by having a number, an indefinite number of things that you can have. Some of those may have tags attached to them to say this is a piece of information of this kind, and they will have ISO 20022 external codes corresponding to those, but others of them may not have any identification at all. They may just be a way of saying, this is what I have in my system. And although for the structured elements, the ETL process is a relatively simple one, for the unstructured elements, I think it becomes very much more complicated. And because we need to be using a lot of unstructured elements because we work from identifiers and with people who typically don't have, for instance, the highly structured addresses the ISO 20022 organization defined in its wisdom. This is something that if we're going to make productive use of this system, we're going to have find some way for ourselves to understand how that works.
Thank you, Michael. I think one of the follow-up question, but I feel like we touched base a bit on this, is like, if you look across the modular loop communities, like you have a lot of different profiles. You have adopters looking at implementing a domestic system. You have adopters looking at implementing a cross-border, like regional solution. My question is like, who within the community should look at leveraging Keystone first? Is there any specific profile?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I think my immediate reaction to that is use it for your own system before kind of branching out into anything in the cross-border space. That's particularly important on the instant payment side, a little bit less so on the RTGS side because of the granularity of data that you receive. Data privacy is, of course, critical in all things around any of your data analytics components, and doubly so when it's instant payments because it's actually people that are doing this. It's not corporations or bank-to-bank transfers like you see. This is a little off topic of your question, but one of the ways that we handled it is we have kind of like a view for admins in our system that allows them to see like those personally identifiable information pieces. And then the normal views have kind of redacted all of that information. So you can kind of give that analytics access to more people without exposing any of these underlying components. But that aside, I think that kind of starting it domestically is probably the best first step because then you're not worried about kind of any cross-border contamination of data.
Thank you. And I guess like that kind of follow up nicely on one of the burning questions that I had after your presentation, but I hold back, which is you mentioned that, let me grab my note to mention the exact terminology, that basically the, sorry, that the data will be extracted from ISO 222, right? And then put in your model and store within your own model of data. Domestically, I think, like, to be fair, there is one version of ISO overall, right? When it comes to cross-border, there are several versions of ISO. And also, like, each jurisdiction have kind of implementing their own flavor of ISO. So how do you do that? Like, do you develop slightly different flavor of, like,
Yeah.
the extractor?
Yeah, so it's configurations everywhere is the name of our project, really. And we actually debated on this quite a lot as the kind of representing the BIS, which hosts the CPMI, which has a very strong view on the way that ISO should be implemented. We thought, well, maybe we start with that and then we can expand it later. And what we actually found is that the more people that we talked to, the more that just wasn't going to work. And so what we've done is kind of every step through the pipeline is fully configurable according to how you're using the ISO standard. So it doesn't matter what message type you put in. It could be a message type that no one's even heard of yet. As long as you put the associated kind of, here is where the element is in the XML path, and here is what this element maps to in that business model semantic meaning, it will still work and it'll still pull those things through. So if you are using something incredibly odd to represent settlement amount for some reason, you could just map settlement amount to that incredibly odd field, and it will still work. Because we were very intentional about that because we wanted, just like the question earlier around kind of the database technology behind it, we wanted to make it as accessible for as many people as we possibly could. And that meant not going down incredibly complex technology stacks and not being overly opinionated on the way that you should use ISO. Now, we do have that messaging standards component. So we are slightly opinionated, but you can also change that.
Yes, thank you for that. I guess before we dig deeper into this, like Michael, I realized I didn't give you the chance to comment on potential adopters that you think should really look at Project Keystone.
I would say that I would expect it would be the regulators and the central banks who would be initially most interested in this. And that's another reason why I think the question of what happens with on-us transactions is an important one. I mean, it was certainly the case, for instance, I was involved when Tanzania were deciding how to set up their TIPS system. And one of the problems they had was that they essentially had three sources of information. One was the information that was going through the TIPS system itself. The other was information which was being reported by banks to their regulator. And the third was information that was being reported by the mobile money companies who were regulated by someone completely different. And although these things were sort of related to each other, they were definitely not the same. And of course, none of them at that time were ISO 20022 in format. But it was a significant problem for the Bank of Tanzania to understand how to merge these data sets with each other so that they could get a comprehensive picture of what was happening in terms of the payments landscape in the country as a whole. And I think that, from our perspective, the people who are going to be most interested, as I say, is how something like this could contribute to a jurisdictional view of the economic activity in the country as a whole.
Thank you, Michael. I guess, like, coming back to a bit my question around ISO and what will be the configuration, and you mentioned like configuration everywhere. So to both of you, from your perspective, which is slightly different because you come from Project Keystone and Michael come from Modello, what do you think will be the prerequisite and the preparation required to ease the implementation of the shells component and the data analytics platform that you mentioned? And I think, like, perhaps for Michael as well, like, because we support ISO 20022 API, but we also support FSP IOP, does that mean that it's only ISO-based implementations that could consider this project, or, like, would we would we also target FSP IOP? So yeah, it's
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think the really short answer is be as normal as possible with your with your ISO implementation. The less bespoke practices that are there, probably the better. The next component is around kind of the ISO adoption journey, which is kind of key here. So we think about ISO in its current state potentially, or in its very early state. There weren't it wasn't mandatory in most jurisdictions to put a structured address in. You could use the unstructured address field, throw in your typical ISO 1500 standard address blob, and that will work. And so as kind of the ISO standard or the adoption of ISO evolves and people start using structured information, they start using IBANs or LEIs or those more structured kind of identifiers. I think that's something that'll be particularly helpful in kind of unlocking the value of data analytics, because if you think about how many ways without structured data you could identify an account, and then you just want to see the inflows or outflows of that account. If you just look at the payments data, you may not necessarily know that these three accounts are indeed the exact same account, because you haven't mapped the IBAN or the person's account number or all of these things together. You don't necessarily have that information. So the further along someone is on their kind of standardization journey, I think the easier that adoption is.
I'm afraid I have bad news on that front. And the bad news is, I said this before, but I'll say it again. In Mojaloop, we don't have account numbers. So we have identifiers. So if I send Micah a payment using Micah's phone number, that gets registered with his phone number as the identifier. If I then send him another one using his passport number, that's get registered as his passport number. There is nothing in the Mojaloop system that enables anyone to say, hey, those two are the same guy. So that's a significant issue for this form of reporting. And as I say, it's a deliberate design decision on our part. We don't want to be passing around personal identifying information in the system because of the kinds of institutions that we want to be able to support. The downside of that is that, as I say, it's very hard for us to connect different representations of the same person, still less the same account, together with each other. Now, one of the things that we were talking about in the FATF Recommendation 16 seminar was that we wanted to use a unique customer number. Now, a unique customer number associated with a payment would be generally reliable. It would not be reliable to the extent that it represents the state of knowledge about a person at a particular time. So if I get married and change my surname, I would get a different unique customer number, because after that, my personal data would be different, and a regulator or a law enforcement agency who wanted to know about a particular payment would want to know what information the system held about me at that time, not what information it holds about me now. So that's a significant issue that we will need to confront when we look at producing information in a form that's going to be usable for something like Project Keystone.
Thank you. I guess my next question is, how do you people engage? So you mentioned the text point earlier in your presentation, but you mentioned central banks. So for example, Bojalo Foundation is not a central bank, and within the community, we have people who are not member of central bank as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working out kind of all of the legality components, but we're going to make this, or our intention is to make this as open as possible, because central banks operate payment systems, private companies operate payment systems. There's a lot of different folks who are involved in this, and we want to get kind of everyone's perspective so that this solution is as appropriate and as applicable to as many individuals or as many payment systems as are possible. So in terms of the timeline, we'll be kind of reaching out to everyone we can over the next month or so, with the idea that we'll actually be giving away kind of a synthetic data set of UK financial activity that's been parsed through the Keystone engine. So you can see purpose codes, you can see when a payment was made, on what date, what time, things of that nature. And that'll give people kind of the ability to look at ISO in its synthetic and doctored, but ultimate form of very structured addresses. And what we want to see is, like, if we get to this standard, what does that unlock? Because we get these questions all the time of, why should I switch to ISO? It's so expensive. Why do we need to change all of these things to actually make this? And what we want to do with this tech sprint is say, okay, here, people who are complaining about this, here is something tangible that's actually really beneficial, that you can start to see those things.
I wanted to add something on a slightly different topic. In fact, a very different topic, though it's kind of related. As Micah pointed out, we dodged a bullet by not using XML, using JSON instead. Unfortunately, the dodge meant that we stopped a different bullet. And the different bullet that we stopped is that JSON structures are not designed for generic parsing. So what I mean is, if you convert a string into a JSON structure, what you get is something that's very easy to write code against, because you can just name the elements in that structure. But there is no metadata about how that stuff is actually structured. If you parse an XML document, then you get information coming out of your ears about what the structure is. And it's very simple to write a generic XML data parser. It's much more difficult. It's not, well, I say more difficult. It's not more difficult. It's possible, but it's much less intuitive to write a generic JSON parser that will consume any message whatsoever. So that's something, again, that we will need to be thinking about in terms of extraction for something like Project Keystone.
Thank you. I'm just going to check, like, do we have Paul online for this session? Yes. Paul, one question to you, possibly, like, would we consider a work stream for this to help adopters engaging with Project Keystone? Okay, perhaps I pose this question because I can see he's on mute. I'll leave a message in the chat for him. Is there any question in the room? I can see we have, like, a few minutes. Oh, fantastic, loads of questions.
Thank you very much for this very important conversation around data analytics. I think you made a very strong statement around data analytics not being a must-have from a core functionality perspective. I think I would say when you are starting, probably you want the system up and doing the primary functions that are needed for money to move from person A to B and so on. But from my perspective, I feel if you are really to look at adoption perspective, I would say that data analytics is really very essential. And what does it mean? Everyone who is supporting, all the stakeholders around instant payment, instant and inclusive and instant payment systems, there are some principles that they don't want to go without, or they want actually to monitor them from the outset. I would say because of inclusivity, for instance. And because of that, like in Rwanda, we supported the eCash to actually take the platform and integrate it with the social registry. Why? Because we wanted to know who is using actually the services, which income segment is using more, which geography, I mean, which areas, male, female, age. All of those were very important because that's, you start actually at start, you want to know who is being excluded as we start, because it's not something that really later on you start figuring out exactly what is happening and who is being excluded. So I think that was really very important. So, and to me, as a question or probably a contribution, I'm just thinking at some point, as a certain team is looking at the core functionalities to ensure that we roll out this system, I think another team should be looking actually at probably data maturity assessment and saying, well, you know, this is where we are as we start as a baseline, and start working on a journey as another team is actually deploying the core and ensure that, you know, whatever actions are listed, they're embedded in the core functions. And to me, it's because actually you want to avoid issues of at data analysis stage, because, you know, garbage in, garbage out, or actually you might actually be creating with the core functionalities, creating a data lake rather than a data warehouse, which can be a problem later on. So it's very important that someone actually takes care of that docket so that then you know even where to focus your campaigns in terms of driving adoption. Thank you.
Thank you for,
Probably not a question, just a contribution.
no,
But nonetheless valuable for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. The first question that I had is, let's say someone wants to integrate the Keystone system, but they don't use yet ISO, they didn't adopt yet ISO 222. Do you have some services that help them to migrate to that technology, or you tell them just first go to ISO and then call us later when you're on there? So the second question is more on, I would like to know especially the scope of insights that you provide. Does it involve fraud, let's say insights, things like that? I would like to know also the scope of insights that you provide. Yeah, the third and the last maybe would be to know, let's say for us, I work for our switch, it's a national switch. I would love to know if, let's say, do you only work with switches, or you can even work with banks to integrate with their core banking systems and everything, or it's just only the central system? Yeah, thank you very much.
I think you can answer that first before I.
Certainly happy to. So to the first comments, obviously I believe that the data analytics component is really important. And as an aside, when you talk to senior stakeholders, it's really cool to explain a payment system, but when they see like a graph network, they're economists, they know what that looks like, and their eyes light up. It's very funny. To the questions, so we designed this to work natively with ISO 20022. The same concept kind of applies to other payment standards that are out there. So you could imagine kind of replacing the ISO 20022 engine with something that's configured to whatever, if it's ISO 1500 standards, if it's some other payment system standard, you could replace that. Now, you would lose some of the analytics functionalities that we've built in, but the same concept could apply, I think. Your question around fraud is a really good one. It's something I didn't add in on the screen. One of the things that ISO provides is a purpose code for when a payment is returned due to a fraudulent reason. We are tracking that as part of Project Keystone. So if you initiate a project or initiate a payment, and some bank down the line eventually gets a phone call that says this was a fraudulent payment, please send it back. We're tracking the originating payment for that, and we're using that, or we're envisioning that that's being used to train the fraud detection software in that particular jurisdiction. One of the things we know about fraud is it's incredibly difficult to find those fraudulent transactions that are being reported, but if we're pulling them directly from the payments data, it might give us a few more transactions. And then your final point, we have focused this at kind of the system level view as opposed to the bank level view. We have gotten many questions from commercial banks kind of around the world because they are particularly interested in the messaging standard component. Like maybe we just run our thing through the BIS thing and make sure it's valid. We haven't really gone down that route at the moment. It's mostly at the payment system level. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. My question is a little bit similar along the lines of what Julie and also Promise have asked. I think what you mentioned at the start, I think at some point in your presentation, you mentioned about the idea is that for Project Keystone to be a plug and play. I have a plug and play approach, right? But as we know, the lovely part of ISO 2022 is that it also has it has an updated version regularly. Like I'm talking about, maybe you know this, you're an expert of PAX, like PAX 8001. Some countries use PAX 008, 001, 06, which doesn't contain the universal end-to-end transaction reference UETR of PAX 008, 001, 10. So how plug and play would it be then, if it depends on what's the latest ISO system that's being implemented and that's available. So that's one. And the second part is that how do you deal with payment switch who doesn't use the right message structure for the right purpose? Like, for example, when you talk about payment return, the one that you should use is PAX 004, but what if they use PAX 008? So all these devil in the details, even if they use ISO 2022, but it's very different flavor. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. The plug and play approach, I think I touched on it a little bit in that you can kind of map your configuration file to whichever standard you're using, and even your bespoke version of that standard if you need to. The question on the UETR is a particularly interesting one because not everyone uses it. We made a bunch of hybrid keys in a lot of our identifiers, so you can like join up the message end-to-end ID with the UETR, and then even if one of them's missing, that's not exactly what we did, but we did something similar to that. So then even if something is missing, you can kind of still treat the message and map it back together. On your second point, we thought about trying to detect this and put it out of scope for our project, to be completely honest. It's a real question and concern about if people are using specifically PAX 9 instead of PAX 8. PAX 8 versus PAX 4, we're probably less concerned about from a higher level perspective. It's more about the due diligence you do on a PAX 8 versus a PAX 9, given that it's individual to individual or financial institution to financial institution. So we haven't looked at that, but it's something we probably should include in a future version. Thanks.
And of course, it's probably worth adding that although that information is available for XML messages, it's not available for endpoints, JSON endpoints in APIs. So you typically not in the API have something that says this is APAX 008, and by the way, it's version 10 or version 6 or whatever it is.
I see Simeon just enter the room and he's looking at me like, please finish this session. So I'd like to thank you both again and thank you so much for your presentation and answering all the questions.